Hey everyone. Before we get started, this episode was actually pre recorded on December 3rd. So, with that in mind, enjoy the episode. From Rixie, this is Butter. I'm Nathan Rivas. The show about chefs and the impact food has had on their lives, their businesses, and the community. Today's conversation with Neal Wavra from Field & Main of Marshall, Virginia. Today, we're going to talk about the dining experience. As someone who is solely focused on the food itself, there's another aspect to dining, and that is the experience as a whole. The atmosphere, the service, the things that make you feel warmed and welcome at places that do it well. I honestly don't know much about building these experiences, so I thought we could talk to somebody that would give us a masterclass in hospitality, Neal Wavra. Neal runs Field & Main in Marshall, Virginia. Field & Main was built to be a beacon of hospitality, with a strong focus on experience, atmosphere, and an incredible wine program. I can't think of a better person to shepherd us through this dining experience.
My name is Neal Wavra, and I'm the proprietor of Field & Main Restaurant in Marshall, Virginia.
All right. So, first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about your relationship with food growing up. What kind of food household did you grow up in?
It's a good question. It was a food household, to put it simply. It wasn't a fine dining food household. It wasn't an upper echelon food household, but the food that I grew up with was certainly and largely informed by my mom's side of the family, the Italian side of the family. My dad had his own impact, which I can touch on certainly too, but we were the type of family that at breakfast, we were talking about lunch, and at lunch, we were talking about dinner. And at dinner, we were reminiscing on that one time, that one place we were at, that we had those amaretto pancakes. Where was that? I don't know. Oh, that was in Michigan, maybe. It didn't really matter. Like the place we went always had something to do with food. And it was the Chinese buffet over there is really great. And this place over here had the best tacos. And we must go and try that out again. And food was important. Food was always the way in which our family kind of communed and had relationships built around food. My mother's side of the family being Italian, we'd go over there and on holidays and things, and we'd have huge meals. I mean, the full-blown Italian meal it was prepared for days that my brother and I would just gorge on and to the point of being sick, and then get up again and go eat some more. Really defined kind of a perspective on food. And then when I was about 15, 13, 14, 15, I started watching Yen Can Cook and kind of PBS cooking shows, the Frugal Gourmet, things of that sort. And so I became pretty interested in the culinary world. And for my 16th birthday, I got a wok and just subjected my family to really soggy stir fries for a long period of time. It was torturesome. But I started cooking family dinners and making dinner, and the culinary world was something that was an interest of mine. And from that point, we were on this like college tour, as you do when you're 17, and looking at schools as potential schools, and we were on an East Coast junket, and I remember looking at Bard College in New York, and we drove right past the Culinary Institute of America, which I would later attend. And my mom said, "Should we stop? You love cooking." And I was like, "No, that's not a legitimate career. I'm not going to do that. No way." I mean, that was me thinking I had to do something different for a legitimate real career. And so we passed on that at that point, which is probably appropriate. I'm glad I went the route I went.
Around what time was that?
That was 1993, 4.
Oh yeah, definitely not considered. You look much younger than you are.
I'm 42.
Okay.
So, that was food was important. Mm-hmm. And to put another fine point perhaps on it, when I did finally select a college, I was looking at a school in Illinois where I grew up. I grew up outside of Chicago, and I had been accepted to Illinois Wesleyan. And on a whim, I applied to a school in Washington State, a tiny little college called Whitman College, which is in southeastern Washington in Walla Walla. And because I liked the paper that they sent for the brochure, it was unique and it was recycled and it was different and interesting and it was far away. It was somewhere new to explore. I went because I got accepted. I went to visit. My mom and dad let me go kind of on acceptance weekend to go check that place out. And I'm there and I'm in the dining hall, staying overnight with a couple people, and we're eating the first meal there. And on the table is balsamic vinegar and olive oil and cruets instead of the white, crappy distilled vinegar and just pure, bland salad oil. And the food's not bad. And I'm looking around countryside that's really interesting and rolling hills. And I was like, I'm going to go here based on kind of balsamic vinegar on the table. It was not the only reason. And when I then said I'm coming here, they sent me a box of 6 Walla Walla sweet onions.
Experiences are everything to Neal. He wasn't wowed by the academics. He wasn't wowed by the facility. He was wowed by the hospitality that this place presented him.
Food was there. It was important. And it just grew from that point. Asparagus grew all over the place, and I would get asparagus. I was the weird kid who never drank. But my next door neighbor in the dorm was the head procurer of alcohol for one of the frats. And I was like, could you give me a bottle of Seven Hills Merlot next time you guys are out getting beer? He was like, sure. So I started drinking wine and tasting things that way. And food always was part of what I wanted to do. And I wandered my way on that first visit to school, to Whitman, into the president's office. And he saw me and we started chatting. And as I matriculated, he and I chatted again. I said, I want to start a cooking club. I want to start something that would feed people and show people interesting food. And I want to call it the Gastronomical Society. And he's like, here's $1,000. Why don't you make dinner for me? So I did. And I bought some pots and pans, and I petitioned the student government to create this little cooking show or cooking program. And I would do like hors d'oeuvres and canapes for art exhibits and things. And I cooked for the president of the college a couple times throughout my time there. And be running all over the dorm with sheet trays of stuffed mushrooms, and people are like, what are you doing? And I'm just stuffing them in people's rooms and all over the place. And so I wasn't good at it, but it was fun, and it was something that was of interest, but again, not legitimate.
Neal calls this experience not legitimate. However, I think that's pretty far from the truth, considering it shows a go-getter attitude that many people don't have at that age, and that seems to drive him from his core.
I went to graduate school in Monterey, California, again, surrounded by food. I mean, just the most amazing markets. Gilroy, the garlic capital of the world, right there, the salad bowl capital of the world, and so in Salinas, and just having an amazing amount of access to wonderful product. And I just personally cooked my way through graduate school, basically. And I would have colleagues of mine in school going like, you've got stock in your fridge. Could I borrow a quart of stock? And I'm like, yeah, I've got 3 different kinds. What kind do you want? I mean, I was playing with food, and food was informing my life. And as I graduated and went to work in DC with a legitimate career in the government, I realized pretty quickly that I wasn't going to make it. I mean, I wasn't going to be a bureaucrat for a long period of time. I just couldn't do it. My boss, I remember advancing a proposal to my boss on an issue that we're working on, and she didn't look at it. She just twisted it with her wrist and pushed it back to me and said, we're not about innovating, we're about maintaining the status quo. And I was like, I'm about finding something else to do. And I had to figure out my parachute, and it was food. So I was in government because I was really interested in the idea of how farms relate to food and small-scale farming in particular, and how it needed to be supported. And perhaps I could change the scope of that with respect to having policy changes. And I just realized pretty quickly that 25 years of working in policy wouldn't impact that issue, and it certainly wouldn't fulfill me. And so I figured if I could own a restaurant at some point, employ a certain X amount of people, 24 folks, serve X hundreds of people, and show them that it might work, I would be fulfilled and interested. I'd be around food and around people. And so I decided to go to culinary school.
Okay. And so you went to the Culinary Institute of America.
The one I passed right by and said it wasn't legitimate.
How long were you in the Culinary Institute of America?
It's about 21, 22 months. It was an associate degree that I got there. You go for about 8 or 9 months, and then you go away in the middle of it to do an externship for five or so months, and then you come back and finish with another sort of 8 or 9 months.
It seems like your time on the West Coast has really informed your attitude towards food. Like that, you explaining that you went to the West Coast for school and were active in a culinary way in your time in college, even though you weren't at a culinary college, really makes sense after talking to you for a short period of time.
Yeah, it definitely did. I mean, it was whether I might have gone to an East Coast school and found food there too. You could argue that point, or certainly I would say that's probably possible. But the abundance and the choice of Walla Walla, an agricultural place. I mean, it has the most millionaires per capita of anywhere kind of west of the Mississippi, I think, and that was principally because if you own a combine and thousands of acres, you were wealthy, but you didn't necessarily have cash. And so that whole area is built on agriculture. There's other things happening there now for sure. And as I was there were 8 or 9, maybe 10 wineries as I left in 1998. And now there's 200 and something of them. So the winery boom has exploded, but the wheat fields were a big deal when I was there, and there was agriculture everywhere. I mean, the Walla Walla sweet onion for sure, but asparagus was outrageously good, and a whole series of produce was amazing. And so having that access, I could go buy that kind of food, and I was excited by that. And then California is just a ridiculous abundance of fresh produce almost all year round. And certainly while I was there, if I left in the summer to go do internships and to be away with the one year in between. And but otherwise, I mean, the Tuesday market in Monterey is extraordinary.
You were active with food over the course of your academic career while you were transitioning into what you called a real career. So at some point it switched where you were like, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to go into food.
Yeah.
You touched on that briefly. Can you elaborate
Sure.
on that a little bit
Yeah,
more?
that was government and working in government and living in DC. I I loved the subject matter and I liked the people I worked with. I mean, I've probably never worked with an overall caliber of education that I did in government. The people were very smart, very committed, very interested. Just the system itself wasn't one that rewarded creativity or ingenuity. I mean, that wasn't the point. And there was just an abundance of redundance. I mean, my position had the equal number of positions in every other administrative office. So there was a me in the labor office, there was a me in the trade office, there was me. I mean, and so it wasn't a place that was fulfilling in a creative aspect, certainly. Although I think some people do well there and have a creative element. I mean, to get things done and through government takes creativity. I just didn't have the patience for it, and I projected out like, God, 20 years of this, and I don't think I'll achieve what I want to achieve. And that connection of the farm and the table was really one of those driving interests as I started to look at myself and say, what is it that you want to have an impact on, and where do you find yourself drawn to, and what are you interested in? The idea of picking food from a farm and preparing it has always excited me.
After hitting brick walls trying to make change working for the government, Neal decides to move to a career where his work has a direct impact on individuals. And for him, that was dining.
Going to Holland, Michigan and picking blueberries as a kid and getting to put those blueberries in pancakes, amazing. I went on a trip with a friend from high school, my best friend, and we went up to visit his uncle in Alaska, and we were in Whittier, and we went on a kayak trip, and we're chipping mussels off of a beach, and I brought a can of coconut milk, and we're cooking mussels off of a beach. Like, nothing to me beats the least amount of time from a farm or from a harvest, a forage to the plate, and that has always excited me. And so I knew I had to do something different, and I thought, well, how do I get into this? I can go work at a restaurant. I was 25, so a little bit behind the curve in terms of having the 18, 19-year-old kind of perspective of having 5 or 6 years to kind of do a 2-year stint at each restaurant to kind of build my repertoire up. And I knew I kind of wanted to be the restaurateur, I thought, more than necessarily the cook. I liked to cook very much, and I thought I would be a chef. I then took that that onus of like, hey, this is not working and I need to figure out what's next to go to culinary school. And culinary school then helped shape the next period for me. And in culinary school, I had always had an interest in wine. As I told you, I was having my dorm mate kind of pick up wine for me in Walla Walla, and in Monterey, I was touring. I was up in Napa, once a month. I was around the Central Coast trying to drink and taste things and just learn. I was reading those publications, Food and Wine, things of that sort, often just because it was an interest. And experimenting. So in culinary school, in the middle, you take a wine appreciation and a wine knowledge course. And as I mentioned, there's a PM and an AM class. So you're on one track for half the educational experience, and then you flip to the PM. So you either start at 6 or you start at 2. And I just took both of them. I just showed up at 6 in the morning and stayed till 8 or 9 in the evening and went through both classes because I was particularly interested. And then I became the wine tutor for the school. And that's where, like you probably know about anything. If you study something, you might learn 50% of what you're studying, right? But if you teach something, you learn 90% of it. So my retention and my understanding of wine became much greater and much better. And I applied for a couple of scholarships at the conclusion of my time at culinary. One was the co-brand KID or COP Foundation scholarship, which sent me to California for 2 weeks, to France for 2 weeks, and Italy for 2 weeks, all paid, plus dining stipends, and a little kickback for the education. It was amazing. And I won the Bordeaux Commandery scholarship, which sent me to Bordeaux for 3 weeks. So I got a quick kind of, in the span of 6 months, I got a really wonderful exposure to a whole bunch of winemaking and the way of winemaking in a whole bunch of different places, in premium places. And I got to drink and eat in a bunch of different Michelin star places. And so I got exposed to a whole bunch of wine and a whole bunch of hospitality and dining fast, without having to pay for it. These scholarships allowed me to kind of go to the premier wine regions, certainly in France. And I started in Bordeaux on a couple-week tour there with another colleague of mine from culinary. And we got to tour, and we were taken in by winemakers, and we got to stay with them. And then they would show us their winery and their cellar, and we would taste, and they would make a meal for us. And it was principally outside of restaurants. So we were all, it was my first foray into really understanding the hospitality that exists around the wine world. And the hospitality is awesome. It's remarkable. It's special. They treat you really well. And I contrasting that to the idea of government, where the bureaucracy was just meant to kind of separate people and to keep issues at bay. This was all about connecting and about relating and about sharing, and the passion that every single one of those people have for their land and for their product and for their family and for what the legacy of that production is, and what the future and the hopes for that production were, and how I was part of that by way of them just welcoming me was exciting. The food was important, the wine was important, but the connection was much more important and much more memorable. And that was really amplified on the co-brand trip, where we were in California and in Italy and in France. And we did get to go to some remarkable restaurants. And as someone who just had graduated a 2-year program in the culinary arts, I got home and I'm reflecting on those times, and I don't remember the dishes. I don't remember the food. I remember dining well. I remember great experiences and sharing that experience with 6 other students who were recipients of the scholarship, 5 others.
Neal mentions a few times that he doesn't remember the food, but he remembers the experience. I personally would come back to a restaurant I was verbally assaulted at if the food was good enough. So it's interesting to hear somebody come at this from a different perspective.
I remember the experience. I remember the feelings. And I realized at that point, wow, I don't think I want to cook. I think I want to craft experiences for people. And I returned home to Chicago. I lived in the suburbs of Chicago. That's where I grew up. And post school, I returned there. And for a graduation present, my mom took me to Charlie Trotter's, which is a great restaurant in Chicago, one of the most well-regarded restaurants of its time for 25 years. And I'm in that restaurant, and I'm blown away by the service. I'm blown away by the dishes, yes, but ask me what those dishes are today, and I don't remember. But I still remember the service experience. I still remember Francisco taking me to the kitchen and showing me what was happening in the action there, and caring for our table in a way that was different from the table next to us. And I remembered the power of that and the impact of that. And so I applied when I got back to Chicago to anybody, any restaurant that was a 3-goblet sort of a grand award winner from the Wine Spectator, of which Charlie Trotter's was one. And I got a couple callbacks, and I got a response call from Trotter's from the chef de cuisine, Matt Murgis, and he said, all right, come on in for an interview, what's called a stage, and bring your knives, because he saw my resume, and it was a culinary graduate, and he assumed I wanted to be in the kitchen. And I said, actually, I was kind of hoping I could go to the front of the house and work service. He said, all right, come in with a suit and show up. And this was right around Christmas time, or right in early December of 2004. And from that point forward, like my trajectory away from the kitchen in terms of being in the professional space of cooking was set in stone for the next, well, until today. I worked in the kitchen a couple of days ago in our restaurant, which is not always a great thing, but so I can do it, but it's not where I've spent my time. So food became a vehicle for creating an opportunity to connect with people, to create an experience that they could remember, to supporting farmers, to doing things that were about fostering humanity, about fostering some form of life, of living in this world. And so so did wine. Wine and food were really the inroads then that I realized that I could use to communicate with people. I have, for whatever reason, the ability to remember what you drank the first time you came in, and I don't remember. Like, I remember we poured Sauvignon Blanc at our wedding, but I'm not always sure when that date was. Right, and that's why I've made our wedding anniversary my PIN number, which really works out well. So I guess if you figure out my wedding anniversary, you'll figure out my PIN. But food and wine are what I know relate to people, and it goes back to what you asked me about in terms of growing up with food. I mean, that those experiences around food and the table are where the family gathered and where friends and I gathered, and the memories that I have the most vivid memories of are food related and are wine related. But it's not necessarily because of the food. It's because we got to share an experience around the food and wine.
Yeah, that's super interesting, hearing somebody passionate about that portion of it, because majority of chefs are extremely passionate about food and can be somewhat combative when it comes to the individuals consuming it. And
Very true.
I am not completely removed from that group of individuals.
I've not met a chef who is. I mean, and then chefs who are in that space, it's understandable because you're putting the egoic mind makes it very difficult for you to separate what someone says about your food, because your food is personal. And so when someone says, I don't like X, or I don't want to eat X, or I don't care what you've done with X dish that you've put out, that's personal. And there's a couple of ways to deal with that, but generally some folks, especially in a tense environment like a restaurant kitchen, will lash back out. And that's understandable, but it's something you can work with. And it's about perspective. I think it isn't personal, and it is absolutely personal. And if you can have the perspective that we're all one anyway, and as I serve you, I'm serving myself, then your perspective shifts. And I'll burn the burger for you if that's what way it makes you happy, because I want you to be happy. Because at the end of the day, you don't care about like the craft I'm putting into the food if it doesn't make you happy. And many times the person who's coming to you and critiquing your dish has a whole bunch of things that have nothing to do with you that are going on. And it's, if you're going to serve them something, then you're taking on trying to serve them as a whole, not just present a refined level of food. And that's not to say that there isn't a place for a refined level of food and that people are going out and dining for that experience. And many people are, and there are really great restaurants that focus on food as art. And, you know, you don't necessarily walk into a play and be like, I don't like how you said that. You know, like that line you delivered, nah, you know, can we do it again? Like, but you can in food. And that's really a hard part. Whereas the artist might get feedback and critique later, and certainly that happens. Someone can critique a chef right on the spot, and it's hard to deal with that for sure. But there's a way in which to say, this is not about the food. I'm using the food to reach you. And so we'll change it if we need to.
Never thought about that way.
No? Oh, cool.
That's really incredible. It's really touching. I get my head straight after that. Yeah, for real. So You went from the restaurant in Chicago and you somehow ended up in Virginia. So let's go over that period of time.
Sure. So Chicago was wonderful. It was formative. You know, I to this day still have a little Charlie Trotter devil and a little Charlie Trotter angel on my shoulders. Who he was a driver of individuals. He would constantly say, "You don't work for me, you work for yourself. And if your standards aren't high enough that they exceed my own, then what are you doing? You know, you need to be pushing and growing." And I learned so much about service. I felt like a 16-year-old getting tossed the keys to a Ferrari. Like, figure it out, man. Here it is. Drive this pristine machine that I've built for years, and that I have a team who is incredibly skilled. And we had the ability there to just, I mean, I remember one couple coming in, it was their 50th anniversary, you know, and they saved up a lot. It was expensive. It was an expensive place to dine. And he would make the argument, Charlie though would, that, you know, you'll pay $90 or $100 an hour for a plumber to come fix your pipes after your toilet backs up, but you won't pay $100 an hour for yourself to have a really grand dining experience. So he could make an argument that it wasn't expensive, but it cost a lot. And this couple came in and they'd never really tried Pinot Noir. Wine was something for a rare occasion, and I had the power because we had three menus with 3 different pairings set up for them and a whole series of by the glasses. I put down 6 glasses and poured 6 different Pinot Noirs and just made it happen. It could happen. So service there was just unbelievable. However, it wasn't about the farm as much. We worked with a lot of great farms, but they were FedExed in. We weren't near the farm. We weren't connected to a farm. Farmers came to us on occasion, and that was an awesome day when that would happen. But they weren't dining in the restaurant. They weren't part of the restaurant. And I was tasked to represent the restaurant at the Relais and Chateau conference that happens every year. It's a Relais and Chateau is an organization that a whole series of European restaurants and hotels in particular are part of, and certainly some of the top tier restaurants in and inns now in the United States are part of. And I went to Geneva, Switzerland. And just by happenstance, I got paired with the proprietor of Blackberry Farm in Tennessee, which is a great inn and a wonderful restaurant. James Beard Award winning now, and a member of the Relais and Chateau. And Sam was my age, the proprietor, who unfortunately now has since passed. But he and I were sitting across the table in a serendipitous moment, and I'm telling him about farm to table and how I got to this point from being a bureaucrat to now being a dining room manager at Charlie Trotter's, and how I was particularly interested in advancing the idea of the farm to table. Long story short, I go home and I get an invitation from Sam to come visit Blackberry Farm. And I had met he and his team because he brought them to the restaurant, and they were really cool folks, and it seemed really interesting. And it's neat to see somebody bring a whole team to a restaurant in Chicago from Tennessee. And Tennessee, I mean, I'm not going to move to Tennessee, but I'll go check it out. And he starts to give me a tour of the property. He's like, and over here's where the farm's going to be, and this is where the creamery is going to be, and this is where the larder's going to be, and this is where the farmstead's going to be, and then we're going to open a new restaurant called The Barn here. And he's like, you should run this. And I was like, okay. Yeah, let's do that. I'm not a farmer. I'm from the Midwest. I ran through some wheat fields. But I took the perspective of hospitality and tried to bring that to Blackberry and help them reorient some of their dining rooms, and grew a perspective of the farm to table there from the guest perspective. So the guest could come down and pick vegetables in the garden, and they would be on the table for dinner later. We were forming connections between people and the earth. It was crazy to see a parent bring a child to the farm and say, this is where carrots come from. The kid's like, no, they come from the grocery store in plastic bags. And no, they're actually in the dirt. So that was meaningful. It was on a different scale, though. It was in a multi-$100 room night that was privileged and perspective, but it was closer to what I was looking for in terms of being able to translate the farm and the table, and a sense of well-being where both of those things existed in some kind of harmonious fashion, or at least a symbiotic fashion. And from that point, I was there for a couple of years. The most important part about that experience is I met my wife there, Star, who, after our time ended there, we were looking at where to go next. And I had sort of at the end of my time there helped them to open that restaurant, the second restaurant on the property called The Barn. And in the process of opening that, we opened for Thomas Keller's entire team from the French Laundry. The first time they had ever all gathered in one place at one time. So all the head chefs of all of his restaurants came to Blackberry for their own personal conference. That's how Sam got them to come. He said he would give them a week of basically comp time to get together and to think and to do groupthink if they would do a series of dinners to open the barn. So I had the task of staffing, operating, and operationalizing a new space for 7 of Thomas Keller's chefs, and then running a series of dinners and lunches for a 3-day weekend that 70 people attended. And so I was like, well, I'll go to California. I mean, I lived out there. I liked California. I'll see if I can get a job at the laundry. I got an interview for the assistant GM position, and I was looking at it, and a friend called and said, hey, we're going to take over a project in Virginia. Would you be interested in that? And I said, yeah, I think so. I went to California and I liked the idea of it. And I mean, it made all the sense in the world, right? That's kind of the pinnacle place to go. Why wouldn't I want to work there? But Virginia represented a new chapter, not a pre-written chapter. And as I was out at the laundry, I wouldn't have contributed anything. I would have just helped make what was already great continue. It would be more of the status quo, and not in a bad way, because that's a pretty amazing status quo. But I wanted to be able to kind of craft my own story, and Virginia offered that. And I was excited. By my time in government, I would play hooky and use my mental health days and go spend time out in Shenandoah. I would go hiking. I would go wine tasting. I went to Linden Vineyards, right, and had goat cheese and a bottle of Seyval. And so I knew of it, and it was exciting to me. And Star and I kind of bantered it back and forth, and we decided to move to Virginia. And we worked for a short period of time at a property in Middleburg, and then we got married, and we took off on a little road trip all around the country, and came back, and we were looking for an organic farm or a farm space to rent, so that we could put a restaurant on it, to kind of create our own variation on the idea of what we had seen and started to work on at Blackberry. And I was talking to a woman who had a farm for rent, and it turned out her dad owned the Ashby Inn in Paris, Virginia. And I said, hey, I'm not interested in working for anybody anymore. I want to kind of start to generate my own story and to create my own project. And he said, well, you could kind of take over and run the inn and the restaurant. And so we did that. We did that for like 4.5, 5 years. And we had the opportunity to buy that space, and it wasn't the right thing. And the Leopolds kind of helped us separate from that. And I figured that, you know what, hey, let's just take a step back, and what is it that we really enjoyed most about it? We definitely didn't really love being innkeepers, the 24/7 kind of experience there. Definitely loved food and hospitality and creating experiences for people. And so we started a little consulting business called Fable Hospitality. Fable, farm, and table, where the two meet. And tried to craft events for some folks. We did some private events and functions. We did some wine tasting, and helped a series of wineries with hospitality-related issues and benchmarking their wines, and just growing and building up their programs. And it's been exciting to be part of an emerging wine region, which is really neat. And about a year into that, one of the most important people in my life now, one of my business partners, approached me and said, you should look at trying to open something in Marshall, Virginia. And we said, no, that's crazy. Because that was in 2013, 14, and nothing was there. So he said, come and take a ride with me around the town, and I'll show you what I think is an interesting opportunity.
I think we should discuss how small Marshall was when they started looking at it. There was a gas station, a cookie shop, and a diner, and that's it. And it's not like the area was lacking in money. It's an equestrian area, and typically dollars follow that hobby. Marshall was primed for a more immersive dining experience.
We took a drive through town, and he started pointing out, why there were certain things that weren't happening in town. He said the water was private for a period of time, and it was then made public through a messy kind of process. But now there's public water, and there's a comp plan to kind of improve the town. And the Marshall Main Street will be revitalized at some point. And there's 2 exits on 66, and there's things happening here, and there's farms all around it. And we want to revitalize this town. And if I can help you do that, let me know. And I said, I'll think about it. And it became attractive, and we started looking for a property on Main Street, and didn't find anything for a period of time. And We were in the space that is now Gentle Harvest, the old Marshall Bank building, and we're on the second floor and looking across the street. And there was this big white house that was there that essentially had been invisible to me. I mean, I'd been up and down the street a few times, and even before we opened, people would say, "Well, what place are you working on? Like, where is that place?" Because it just kind of receded in the background, even though it's a 3-story place that's right on Main Street, directly on the sidewalk. And I was on the second floor, and that's when it kind of emerged and said, "Well, so what's up with that building?" And they said, "Well, the woman who used to live there passed away, and the bank has it, and at some point it'll probably come up for sale." And I said, "Well, at that point we should look at it." And we eventually got to see it and had a showing. And as Star and I walked through the door, on my lips were, "We're never going to work in an old building again like we did at the Ashby, because we fought that old building. It was never built for hospitality. It was an old family home that was converted to be a cute, quaint country inn, and tiny rooms that never seated more than 10 or 15 people. It was challenging, and the plumbing was horrible. And for every $1 of heat you spend, $1 of heat went outside, right? I mean, so it was just a mess, and I didn't want to deal with that for sure. But we opened the door to this building that the oldest portion goes back to 1790. The main part of it is kind of 1829. And I went, shit, we're working here. It all flooded. My first walk through, I had this vision of what was going to happen. And 2+ years later, that vision is what you see when you walk through the door now.
So I want to talk about some of your setbacks, if
Sure.
you're comfortable with that.
Absolutely.
Over the course of your career, you've worked at 4 very fine establishments. Am I right on that number?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you said that you've had maybe not the best endings with some of those.
Oh, for sure. I think that, everything's perspective, but I was jettisoned from Blackberry and from the Goodstone and from the Ashby. And I wasn't really ready to leave those places. I wasn't going to find the volition to leave those places, but needed to leave those places to write my own story and to craft something. So in the moment, yeah, they were painful and difficult and challenging. And I felt wronged, and I put my heart and soul and treated every one of those places as though it was my own, which it wasn't. And that was part of the problem. But being then jettisoned to find the next spot helped me to grow and to develop and to learn. And that's been a great life lesson in terms of figuring out, hey, when one door closes and maybe a window opens, or maybe you have to kick a hole in the wall to get to the next spot. It's not a bad thing. Good or bad is just a polarity that you attribute to situations. And experiencing the bad in the moment is appropriate. But every one of those experiences had led me to a better one, and a more interesting one. And that's been fascinating and rewarding. And it's led me to here. So I could never have projected that, from being a bureaucrat in Washington, D.C., I would end up an hour away running a restaurant in Marshall, Virginia, a space that I drove past as a bureaucrat and never even thought to stop in, a space I drove past for 4 or 5 years on my way from Warrenton to Paris, to the Ashby, and never stopped in. So I needed those things to happen along the way. And the challenges make it that much more rewarding. That's kind of cliche perhaps, but even in the construction of Field and Main, I mean, we met with a whole series of challenges along the way. And those challenges, they were embarrassing. They were difficult to deal with. They were costly. But I don't remember them now. I mean, they're not what I think about most when I think about Field and Main. The experience of having accomplished the opening is what I remember, and what I focus on, and what my team and my family rely on at this point. So, I mean, those little challenges and big challenges are just part of it.
So you purchased the place that you're at, and it took 2 years to open your doors, right?
Yeah, we purchased in October of 2014, and we opened in September of 2016. And I sort of just took a leap. I like I told you, we just knew when we walked through, and from that point, I had to figure out how to buy the building. I didn't have the funds to do it, so I had to raise the money. And my partner Peter was the first person to kind of help, but he wasn't going to be the sole investor in the project. And what I was looking for was a little different than what a lot of my peers were, where they were looking for spaces to rent. And I watched and learned from other restaurants, basically, that would establish. And if you make it past 3 years, you got a good chance kind of making it to 5 years. And if you make it past 5 years, you got a good chance, again, kind of going further. But if you're doing well enough to make it that far, a lot of landlords then look at you and go, hey, you look like you're doing great. I'll take more rent. And your razor thin margin anyway is going to then be diminished, and you may not be able to make it past that point, and then you relocate. And having lived somewhere for 2 years, basically, essentially for a bunch of time, and then a little bit longer time with the Ashby, we were kind of ready to root in, and our family had started, and two daughters were born, and I didn't necessarily want to have that uncertainty. And so I wanted to buy the building. I wanted to control the real estate. And my mom's family and my dad were also in real estate. And so I kind of understood that context. And McDonald's is not a food restaurant. It's a real estate company that happens to dispense food. And while we're not certainly trying to be McDonald's, I wanted that control. And so I set out to try to raise money and to build a community of people who would get the idea of what Field & Main was going to become and wanted to be part of that, because it's not a great investment to be putting money into a restaurant. But we were able to leverage, say, this is not just a restaurant, it's a piece of property that will be developed to be a restaurant, that will be a community space. And so can we put together a group of people? And the time it took to do that, we raised a certain amount of money and started doing some construction. And that construction found some asbestos and found some structural issues and found the problems that you find in a building that's 200 plus years old. And we began to deal with some of that and had a contractor that kind of helped with some of that to begin with, and then realized that wasn't the contractor that would probably see the project through. And a couple of the investors that come on had said, time out, I want you to get all the money before I put any more of my money in. You got to be able to finish the project. I'm not going to get my sunken cost in and then not be able to get it out because we don't have a restaurant to return the investment. So it took me, we had no construction going on for months as I was trying to find the people. And it wasn't terribly difficult to find the people. It turns out that the most challenging part was once I got someone to say yes, it was to actually get them to write the check. So, because it was awkward. It wasn't like, remember last week when you said you're going to give me a certain amount of thousands of dollars? Can I have that check now? Can I come by later and pick that up? That just didn't work. So, and if I didn't catch somebody on Monday, that sort of week went away and it would roll into another several weeks. And so the raising of the money and finally getting all the funds together to the point where we had the full kitty to be able to then start construction meant that we were also put behind the eight ball because we didn't have a contractor. And once we had the money, then we could get a contractor because they needed to know when they could start. And then we had also have a contractor to kind of build out the budget. So it was back and forth. It was a really harried time. And I was consulting, trying to make a living, to put together enough for our family to live on to then be able to do this project. And so it was a really exciting time when we finally actually got all the checks written and the group of people together. And we were using hospitality in a shell space. Like I was buying fried chicken from the IGA or tacos from down the street at the gas station and bringing investors in and saying, hey, let's do this. This is what we're going to do. And like, oh, okay, sure. I don't see what you're talking about here. And I had this vision. I was just spinning this idea. This is where the hearth's going to be. This is where the kitchen's going to be. This is the dining room for this space. This is the more formalized dining room. This is where the bar is going to be. And so I had to sell it. And then once we sold it and we actually got the money in, we started construction. And then that took us about 10 months of like more consistent construction to kind of get the project open.
Once construction was done, like, you were not the chef for Field & Main.
No,
All right.
no.
So is your current chef the one that you started with?
Yeah, in fact, we brought him on. So he and I went to culinary school together.
Okay.
His name is Anthony Nelson, and he and I were in school together, but also friends in school, and we're on the same station. And some of the last kind of experiences we had in the restaurant row kind of circuit at the end of the associate degree, you go through a series of restaurants and actually cook for the public, as opposed to just cooking for culinary students. And he and I were on stations together, and he's a friend, and he was in Nashville, and I said I was looking for a chef, and same sort of way I was kind of trying to find a contractor. It's like, I need a chef who will be able to work in the next 6 months to a year, maybe. I'm not sure when. So who's that person? I started interviewing some folks, and some of them took jobs because they needed a job and they were up for grabs. And he was working at a spot in Nashville and was about to take a chef job at another spot, and that fell through. And he was working at a restaurant just sort of to also kind of bide time, but it was a great spot. It's a really cool restaurant. called Lachlan Table. And so he wasn't in the chef role. He was in sort of a lead line cook role there. And he had never really been a chef yet. He'd been a sort of a sous chef and worked kind of in that spot and was ready for sort of the next step in his career. And we were sort of in that space too. I wasn't looking for a chef-driven restaurant, so I didn't need a chef that had a full-blown name and an agenda. I wanted hospitality to be front and center about the experience. I wanted great food. I wanted a great experience that went along with it, and I wanted it to be relaxed and refined and comfortable. And that's what we're trying to shoot for. We want a place where you can come for a burger on Thursday night and a beer in the bar. You can come for your 25th anniversary too, and we'll try to make each one special in its own way. But we do it, and our kind of goal, our sort of informal goal in the house, is to be able to hug whoever walks through the door because we know them well enough. And that's a very big difference from the other places that I got to work, where one, you don't touch the guest. That was like a horrible thing to do. That connection is inappropriate, and you wouldn't see someone with frequency enough to do that really. And when you did, it was a rare occasion. Somebody who can afford multi-$100 meals on a regular basis, enough for you to get to know them, is pretty awesome. And we had that relationship with a number of folks for sure, but I wanted that with more people. And I also wanted it to be in a place where those farms we were featuring the farmer could show up in the door. And that's been some of the best experiences by far thus far, have been somebody telling me like, wow, this salad is delicious. And it's just a simple green salad. And I'm like, well, talk to them, because that's Daniel. Daniel makes the vinegar that's in the salad dressing, and he's right here. And they grow the greens. They're in the building right now. They're here. They can be here because they live here. And we use their food. And they're supplying you, and they're supporting you, and we are supporting them. And together, we're one. That's the exciting part about doing what we're doing in this space and in this place. And the restaurant itself was built to do that. That's what was the remarkable part that I kind of left out. I mean, in that first tour, the forward portion that's on Main Street was built by a guy named John Flowerly back in the 1800s to be a tavern, a restaurant, a place of hospitality. And when you walk in, the first entryway is high ceilings and large. And if you're heating that by wood or coal, it was a folly. You would never do that as a family home. You turn left into the main dining room. It's 9-foot ceilings and it's big. You can seat 30 people in there, and it's heated by a fireplace. Like, that's not a space you would ever have a family home in, because you just couldn't have managed that. It was built for people. So it's neat to be able to use that space. And once we finally opened, the space just pressed right back into service like it had always wanted to be. It was meant for that. It's got a whole bunch of little rooms. It looks a lot bigger once you get inside than it does in the front, but it has a flow to it. It just feels like it should be embodied by people.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So another thing I wanted to talk about, you went to culinary school.
Yes.
And you were also the owner and proprietor of a restaurant.
Yes.
That is not a common situation for a lot of restaurants. So what is your relationship with your chef like? Because I've worked at places, I've started kitchens at places, and the owner of the place is not
I've worked there too.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I'm interested in knowing how a proprietor who was trained as a chef interacts with a chef while not acting as the chef.
Sure. That's a great question. I hope the chef would say interact well. He has control of the menu. I mean, it's his job to run an appropriate food cost. It's his job to create the menu, and it's his place to kind of create a culinary expression. And every chef I've worked for has had a voice or was developing one. And I want him to do the same. And I know that if you start to kind of impinge upon that, there's conflict, one, and I'm not a big fan, even though I studied conflict resolution. I don't want conflict. You don't get the best out of somebody by trying to dictate. And I try to set parameters, and I'm more of the shepherd, kind of behind, just like, no, we're going this way, not that way. Let's kind of stay in this realm. And that's what I do for everybody there now. My role is not to do as much as it is just to kind of support. And it's a really weird role to be in, because I came up doing from the cooking side, certainly in culinary school, and then absolutely from the operational side. I was a very proficient server and a sommelier and a hell of a damn good food runner. I loved food running. I can wash some dishes. So that experience of going to culinary school has given me an appreciation for all parts of the restaurant. And I think that would be one piece of advice I'd give anybody who thinks about running a restaurant, is if you don't like doing dishes, you probably shouldn't own or run a restaurant. If you can't step into some degree somewhere in that space and help out, I'm no longer like the most proficient person in the spaces, and that means we're getting better, and that's a really good thing. The people who are running the bar know way more about the bar than I do. Anthony knows more about technique and food than I do, and I'm less knowledgeable about that. I'm getting to be a generalist in the context of running that restaurant, and I need someone to run the front, and I need someone to run the kitchen, and I need someone to do the books. And my job is to just make sure they're all there and kind of working as a cohesive unit. So and heading in a direction, and that's exciting. The culinary aspect. I would have a hard time leading that team without having had that experience, because I don't know that I'd have the ability to speak and to give the feedback that I need to and want to. And it's helped, I think, to give my team perhaps a little bit of confidence in what I say, right? And to appreciate where I'm coming from.
Field & Main is a clear beacon of hospitality and a masterclass in the dining experience. A place I will go out of my way for to buy a bottle of wine. And coincidentally, I did last week. They are absolutely invaluable to the Virginia dining scene. And with Neal and his team executing their vision, it will continue to be a place for everybody to go out of their way for. Butter is a production of Rixie. Produced, edited, and mixed by myself, Tanner, and Mason Carlton. Special thanks to my parents for being supportive of me through this whole process. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, leave us a review and rate the show. It really helps out.